in that space is struggling. So I want to just say from the institution, thank you very much for being here. Thank you to the panelists. And if you need anything, please don't hesitate to let us know. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Yeah. I wanted to also thank Alianza Americas for giving us the opportunity and the ability to streamline this presentation, this panel discussion. We know that a lot of people would like to be here, but they are, either working and providing services right now, but this is a way for them to also get all the information that our panelists have to share with us. Also, for those that are online and looking at the presentation, we do have a way for you to ask questions. I'm going to ask Nayeli to just share that information with you.
For those of you who would like to submit questions, use our Twitter handle at CLMH_TCS, and we'll make sure we're going to monitor that throughout the presentation. Again, that is at CLMH_TCS.
Mm-hmm. And for those of you here in the room, you will also have we'll have time for questions, Q&A. We wanted not just to bring the expertise of our panelists, but also we wanted to be able to respond to some of your questions or your comments. So after each one of them have an opportunity to address with their expertise, we'll open it up for questions. So I will ask each one of the panelists to please take 5 to 7 minutes to address the issues, starting with a little bit of introduction for those of you that you don't know who they are. I'm going to allow them to introduce. So perhaps we wanted to start with the part of immigration, and then we'll address at the end how the immigration has impacted or is impacted our immigrant communities. So perhaps we start with Claudia or?
No, Claudia.
Okay, perfect. Please.
Okay, well, hello everyone, how are you? Thank you, Mayra, and for the invitation to be here with all of you today. My name is Claudia Lucero. I'm the Executive Director of Chicago Religious Leadership Network, CRLN for the short name. We are an interfaith-based organization here in Chicago that we do our work related in human rights and advocacy, linking our work here in Chicago to the issues of economic and social justice and human rights in places in Latin America, especially in Central America. And we also been doing some work around the immigration, more in terms of the sanctuary movement. Among our congregations, there is part of our network. And so to start with, in CRLN, right after the elections back in November, and we've been talking about this, those issues, and going back a little bit in history in the sanctuary movement, this is nothing that is new. There has been working in the last couple of years. The sanctuary efforts, and there being even like in the 1800s during the slaves, helping them when they were running away from their masters, or like during the World War II, in the European monasteries, using those spaces to harboring the Jews and other minorities. They were like running against from the genocide, or like in the 1980s in the U.S., a huge movement around the sanctuary that I was working with our brothers and sisters from Central America, fleeing away from the violence and the oppression of the governments back then. So there was one of our work that back in 1990 that we started again with this sanctuary initiatives among our congregations, and to understand this whole idea. For the last several years, several immigrant-led organizations and others, interfaith communities that we've been working so hard in terms of passing immigration law that is more justice and humane for our brothers and sisters, and I mean, nothing happened. The alarming rate of deportations in the last couple of years, that is, I mean, this is a tremendous impact on our families. And obviously, I mean, back then when Obama granted deferred actions for, especially for undocumented students or minors, and the failure of the DAPA deferred actions for their parents. And so through all this work that we've been having, I mean, as people of faith from my organization, that we have a responsibility to act, along with other partners that have been advocating to stop the deportations. And it is, I mean, right now it's time to escalate to an effort to keep the families together by offering our neighbors who face a deportation order safe refugee and sanctuary in our congregations among our network. So one of the work that we've been doing in the last several years is like working with those congregations, those churches, to have the safe space for those undocumented students, and to provide this physical space for them as well. And you know, how to declare the sanctuary. This is a process that I've been also learning during the time that I've been working with them. And is once the attention, the case, they bring us into attention a particular case, specifically to the social justice committees among those congregations or any other type of committee that works with immigration, it's taken into the council of the church. And when the church make the decision to do something like this and to accommodate the physical space of it, so it's starting to mobilize the community. And when I say mobilize the community, is not only the people in the church, but also like outside allies and partners that we have, and also the advocating for that individual, for that family, as a matter of fact. So once the congregation makes that decision, they have to make it public. And the way they make it public is, I mean, usually by a press conference. They do it, and along with prayer or vigil within the congregation and their members. So when the individual, I mean, living in a sanctuary is not an easy task for that person or for that family. And because it has a financial cost. If the person works, I mean, that person has to leave their job. And probably taking the whole family into the sanctuary as well, or not. It depends, and the family decide how they wanted to do it. And I mean, the media is there all the time once they know, and a lot of the time it's hard for the family to deal with those things, to mention and the story over and over and over. I mean, it's a burdensome for the whole family, especially when if their kids around. So the advocacy is like, we have to be advocating on behalf of that individual, for that person, the family, and working in partnership with the legal service providers, along with other immigrant-led organizations around. The way we've been doing the sanctuary efforts right now is, this is like, it's a collective effort with all those partners. It's not just the church, as like I said, is the legal service provider, the lawyer, or any other organization. Immigrant-led organizations around that too, that we accompany that individual, that person. During the advocacy work, I mean, that's a lot of the things that we can do, that we have to do, is making phone calls, getting the allies that they're gonna help us in terms of other religious leaders, leaders in the in the city councils, that they can advocate on their behalf of those families, to make phone calls, to make letters to the administration, to the White House administration, to the Homeland Security offices, and those things. The media, we also have to come with a media plan to accompany the whole process of it, and to get the right attention among the outside community. So the leadership on for the ones who are in the sanctuary movement, or the ones who are seeking for that sanctuary, is like, we have to take in consideration the person's will, how did they wanted to do it, because they put in everything on the line, and they're often risking a lot of the things. So their leadership, their voice, their opinions, their wisdom is always taken in consideration all the time. So they are involved in the whole process of it. I mean, right now we have a person in one of our congregations, and that person is taking the lead. I mean, we asked them like why they wanted to do it. Over the summer, the whole family was living there because the kids were on break. Right in September, well, the mom and the kids, they went back to their house. But, so this is are the kind of things logistically how impact the family when they have to do this. We have to remember also that what we do for them, for our brothers and sisters, when they seeking and when they are in sanctuary, it's something that we don't do it for them. It's something that we do with them. So it's not a service. We're trying to also to empower the person. Like I said, I mean, it's so hard for a family to be there. For the church, the logistics, I mean, sometimes it's a long process, depends on the church and depends on their own regulations. Logistically, well, they have to make sure that they have the space. And that means have a room, have a bathrooms for showers for them. They have to come up with a plan in terms of fundraising to make sure that they have the means to provide sanctuary for them. And they need volunteers because we need to accompany the person all the time. And for this case that I was telling you, the members of the church, they volunteer to be with him and the family all the time. And this is a very interesting dynamic. I mean, the church is interracial, so we have volunteers, white volunteers, African American, Latino, that engage with this Latino person, with this man. And it's like, it's amazing. It's like the sense of community, the sense of family that develops out of this. And so, because the whole idea is we want to make them feel that they're at home. Like, for example, some of the times the volunteers used to come to the visit with food, but uncooked food. So they used to cook in the church like a family to make it like a regular day, or at least the best we can do for them to be the closest for a regular day for them, like if they were to be at home. The church usually made several fundraisers and also like help the family since the person had to leave the job, as I mentioned before. So it's like at least to give them some kind of money for them to keep living on the expenses. And also like trainings and the involvement of other congregations is so important. I mean, like right now we're working with 20 congregations that they declare themselves as welcoming congregations. Not necessarily that they provide sanctuary, but we're working towards that. But like I said, I mean, it's a long process and it requires a lot of planning and time and resources, not only human but also economic resources to do something like that. So in the meantime, we also invite other leaders from other congregations so they can see the work that one is doing. Like University Church in Hyde Park is the one that we're working so closely with them. They have a long history in this sanctuary movement since the 80s. So they're like great experts, and when we invite all the leaders for them to see is like, in order to convince them so that they can become a sanctuary congregations as well. And we also have and we develop toolkits for them to get more familiar with the process, in doing this, to make sure that we have more congregation churches to provide this kind of, to provide this sanctuary. We are having different conversations around this, like the urgency to be ready if we need to provide the safe space and the physical space and all what it comes with, the advocacy and the legal protection for those, for our brothers and sisters. So, thank you.
Do you want me to follow? Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Oscar Chacon. I'm the Executive Director for Alianza Americas. We are a national network of Latin American immigrant-led organizations throughout the country. And not only do we do a lot of policy advocacy work in the U.S., but we also do the same in relationship to our countries of origin, particularly Mexico and Central American countries. Partly because we are of the belief that if people in their own countries had the opportunity to live dignified lives, they would be far less likely to want to come, to a country like the U.S. So the only responsible solution to actually bring some equilibrium, to why people leave, why people migrate, why people engage in human mobility, we believe is to build better societies, both at home, meaning the U.S., but also in our own countries of origin, because that's the only way we will be able to actually bring balance to what, frankly, is altogether a very positive event. I mean, migration throughout history, contrary to what we may have heard, during the electoral campaign that ended on the 8th of November, migration has historically been essentially a net positive phenomenon, for the countries to where people go to, as well as for the countries from where people came from. And again, I mean, that is just a factual statement what I'm making. I mean, you are welcome to check as much as you wish. I mean, but from an economic point of view, from a tax collections point of view, from a cultural enrichment point of view, societies get better, when migration happens. So it is therefore sad and frankly silly that migration became, such an important issue in this past electoral campaign. I often say that it wasn't just hatred against Mexicans and immigrants and Muslims that resulted in the election of Donald Trump. I mean, there are more reasons, that explain why Donald Trump became elected president. And I think it is important to understand that I've been saying this pretty much from the 8th of November in the evening, that it would be a mistake to assume that everybody who voted for Donald Trump is a racist. Because the reality is, I mean, it's a lot more complex than simply saying that people are racist. I mean, I do believe that hatred against those I don't know was masterfully used, by Donald Trump in this electoral campaign. It was one of 3 key criteria that, in my opinion, drove his electoral campaign. And one cannot deny, I mean, that it worked. I mean, that's why he is president-elect today. And it's not so much that he got most people in the U.S. to vote for him. Once all votes are counted, chances are that Hillary Clinton will have close to 2.5 million people more votes, than Donald Trump. But he did succeed in making more people vote where it mattered the most, namely, the states that were decisive in terms of the electoral college system that we use to select, the president of the U.S. Now, with that said, and because I know that might ask for 7 minutes, and I'm going to try to be disciplined in the 7 minutes, I want to quickly address the fact that one question that a lot of people have asked me in the US but also abroad is, how much will Donald Trump comply, with everything he promised in the campaign trail? And the reality is that we need to be very sober about the fact that candidates, when they are running to get elected, they promise everything they can. They promise heaven and earth, to anybody that they can possibly entice to come and vote for them. I think that that's what Donald Trump did, but if you look at the history of how much electoral promises really become the program of government, there is a big gap, between what gets to be promised and what actually can get done, and they get done. And so I don't think that we are in face of a dramatically different situation, even though the Congress, both the Senate and the House, will be under Republican majorities. But let's not forget that Donald Trump was not the universally liked candidate, in the Republican field to begin with. There were plenty of Republicans that actually opposed Donald Trump in the way to become elected president. As a matter of fact, one piece of good news, and I believe that this is important because we are going to have to keep an eye checking on these issues, but also advocating in the direction of what just got to be announced yesterday. Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, announced yesterday that he's going to be filing legislation in the US Senate to actually solve the situation of the young immigrants who have benefited from a program called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. There are about 800,000 young kids who actually apply for this program and actually enjoy today of protection from deportation and a work permit if they apply for it. And I can tell you one thing for sure, there is no precedent in the history of the US when a program like DACA was given and then taken away. It has never happened. And I think that we are far better organized today than we have been in the past, in as far as making sure that DACA does not become the way where we break, with that precedent of taking away rights. And I'm not saying that they're not going to try. All I'm saying is that there will be plenty of resistance, not only in the form of the sanctuary churches that Claudia was speaking to us about, but in terms of really mobilizing very thoroughly people who deeply disagree, with the notion that the way to solve our immigration policy challenges is by rounding up people and deporting them. Because that's just simply inhumane. I do believe that it is important to understand that the one characteristic about the Donald Trump campaign, and I believe it will be a characteristic of the Donald Trump administration, is the lack of capacity to predict what he's going to do. So unpredictability is going to be a very important factor to keep in mind. I do have to say that just based on the news of the last 24 hours, any notion that he was going to go head on and fight against bankers and Wall Street, you can rest assured that that's not going to happen. And again, that's a very flat contradiction from what he actually promised, in the campaign trail. So we just need to keep very actively monitoring what goes on. I do believe that we need to keep an eye on who is he going to name to be the new Secretary of Domestic Security, the Department of Homeland Security, because that may actually give us a very good indication about what will he actually do from everything that he threatened, to do in as far as the rights of people who live in this country, by and large, having only committed one infraction. And that infraction is to either come in, through the border without inspection, or overstaying their visas, when they came into the country. And by the way, I'm sure you all know that most people who are without the status in the US did not cross the border illegally. Most of them actually came with a visa to the US and they just overstay, the terms of their visa once a year. So just to wrap it up, I mean, in terms of potential scenarios, he promised during the campaign trail 3 or 4 things that are very scary. You know, one is that he was going to indeed round up and deport every single person without the status living in the U.S. That's about 11.5 million people. That's simply impossible to do, but that's one of the things that he promised. We need to keep an eye on that. And the DACA kids and other groups of immigrants who are already here, who actually enjoy of work permits. DACA is not the only program of its kind. There are several other programs like it. We need to keep an eye on those and defend the right for those people to remain safely in the U.S. Second of all, he promised the wall, you know, to build a wall, and that Mexico was going to pay for the wall. He already is backing down, I mean, on that. I mean, he's already saying that maybe it's not gonna be a wall, maybe it's gonna be just a little fence here, a little fence there. But bottom line is we do need to keep an eye on that. We also need to keep an eye on the practice of actually rounding up people, not necessarily deporting them, but placing them in detention centers. Why do I say that? Because detention centers have become heavily privatized. There are basically 2 major corporations, Correctional Corporations of America and the GEO Group, that have made tons of money, you know, as a result of detaining people on a nightly basis at the rhythm of 34,000 people per night. And that's been true under Obama. I mean, let's face it. I mean, it's not like he's going to do something new. But I noticed that on the day after the election, the 2 companies I just mentioned, their stock value went through the roof. I mean, because they are predicting, you know, at least hoping, that they will have a lot more business, so to speak, to conduct. So those are some of the issues that I really believe we need to keep an eye on. And the last thing I will say is, I, for one, happen to be optimistic that it is not true that because the Republicans will be in majority in the Congress and that Trump will be president, there is absolutely no chance for immigration policy reform via legislative changes. I happen to believe that there are chances for that to happen. 2 weeks ago, I was telling people, be assured that there will be Republicans filing legislation to address the situation of the Dreamers, I mean, the so-called DACA recipients. Most of my friends, I think even my staff, was very skeptical about it. Well, as I just told you, Lindsey Graham just filed legislation yesterday, or announced that he's gonna file legislation yesterday. So I do believe that there are openings, but we need to be clever and very persistent in our advocacy to not just cross our arms and wait a miracle, you know, to happen. I mean, we need to make it happen. Thank you.
Just for those online, they are asking to speak up because it's been really hard
to hear.
You know, to hear. So,
Okay.
Chavez.
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Nayeli Chavez. I'm a faculty member here at the Chicago School. I'm also the lead for the Latino Mental Health Concentration. And so today I want to talk very briefly for maybe 10 minutes about the psychological impact of all of the things that the first 2 presenters were talking about. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of context. For those of you that are not as versed in immigration, why people come, some of the presenters already talked a little bit about it, but I want to talk more about what propels people to come to the United States. And there's many factors, many reasons why people come, but we can all sum those factors into one thing. People come to the U.S., they leave everything behind, looking for some kind of hope. Hope to reunite with their family members that may have been living in the U.S. already for a while, hope for better economic opportunities, hope for safety. A lot of people are escaping their countries of origins because of increasing levels of violence related to gangs, related to the drug cartels, related to poverty. So when people come here, they come looking for some level of hope. They're gonna have something that perhaps was denied to them in the places that they come from. Now in the last year, and I will say it's not just the election and what happened during the election, but the last year and the promises that were made, the statements that were made during the election were very harmful psychologically for people of color. We're talking today just about, or focusing specifically on Latino immigrants. But the statements and the promises that were made were harmful for people of color and members of oppressed communities in general, for the LGBTQ community, for Muslims, for people of Jewish faith, for women, right? For Latino immigrants in particular, it was very difficult because we saw a person that was making statements that were racist, that were xenophobic, that were hateful about our community. And those statements, for many of us, I remember the first time that this individual came on national news talking about Mexicans, and Mexicans are criminals, they're rapists. Many of us took it personal because it is personal. When they say Mexicans come here, they don't bring anything, they're criminals, they're rapists, they're talking about me, they're talking about the other percenters, they're talking about Latinos in this country who have contributed to making this nation successful. So the psychological consequences didn't begin in the election. They began since this individual began or made a decision to run for presidency. And many people started to worry back then, not just adults. My specialization is in children. But I started to see children around me beginning to worry about what is going to happen, because the statements that were being made were very specific, right, about what he was planning to do. So regardless of what he ends up doing, I think the harm has already been done, and it's been done to adults, but most importantly to the children that have listened to those statements, and started to imagine a world where perhaps their community, their parents, their siblings may be taken away by force from their homes. Again, we don't know whether that's going to happen, but the fear that was instilled in our community is real. And as mental health professionals, is something that we need to be aware and that we need to address. So what happened during the election? Well, for Latino communities, for immigrant communities, and I will extend that for other communities of color, there were a lot of reactions, most of which were not positive. There was denial. How could this happen, right? How could a person that had threatened women, people of color, people from different faiths, people from the LGBT community, still go ahead and win the election? So again, I don't know if the people that voted for him are racist, but it doesn't matter because they were willing to support somebody that had made racist, xenophobic, sexist, homophobic statements. And so for a lot of people, there was denial. How could that happen? For many people, for the immigrant Latino community, there was a lot of fear. That day in the morning, I found myself in my own family and in my community talking to a lot of people that were terrified. What is going to happen? What am I going to do? How am I going to protect my children? There was a lot of anger. How is it possible that the contributions that immigrants make to this country are not recognized? Again, people were taking it personal, many people, because it is personal, right? There were experiences of physical symptoms. Some people were not feeling well, headache, stomachache, we call it in psychology or in mental health, psychosomatic symptoms, right? Experiencing stress through physical means. There was irritability. A lot of people were just in a bad mood. I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want to see anybody. I don't want to be faced with what's happening. For some people, it was withdrawal. Just the need to be alone and think about what's the next step. Some people were feeling numb, like I just don't know what to do with myself. I don't know how to feel. Difficulties paying attention. Here in the school, some students were talking about it's really hard to go to class and pay attention, concentrate, try to do homework, prepare for exams, helplessness. What is going to happen? There is nothing I can do about it, and hopelessness. Things may not get better. Again, regardless of what happens in the end, all of these things were experienced and they were real, and they lead to significant psychological consequences that as mental health we need to pay attention to. So what are the psychological consequences for the different segments? So if we were to break the Latino, Latinx community into different segments that may be affected and have already been affected by the election, I'm going to talk first about the youth that Mr. Chacon was talking about that have benefited from DACA. They themselves call themselves DACA-mented because DACA, this program, gave them the ability to have some kind of legal status, a permit to work in the country for 2 years, and some of them have already renewed it. So what are the challenges for them? Well, again, regardless of what happens, whether Lindsey Graham's proposal goes through or not, racism has already been experienced by these youth, and many of them are already experiencing a lot of hate crimes in the community, in their communities and in their colleges and universities. So experiences of racism and xenophobia were increased, and many of the people that had already these feelings inside felt empowered, emboldened by what happened during the election. So think about the psychological implications of all these youth now not knowing what's going to happen to them, but also facing this in the places where they go to study. There is practical challenges. What's going to happen? There is an uncertainty to what's going to happen, uncertain future. Many of these youth have jobs now that they were able to get because of the permit that they have. There is an increasing number of youth who apply to colleges and universities with DACA, and so if DACA is taken away or is replaced, what's going to happen with them? If their permit is not renewed, the jobs where they work may not be able to maintain them as employees. So there is financial consequences as well. We know that the president-elect now had promised that many of these programs, executive orders that President Obama had signed, will be ended. So even if it doesn't happen, the past year has been a year of stress and of significant levels of trauma for many of these youth. There is questions about educational opportunities and what's going to happen, and the consequences in terms of mental health for these youth include anxiety, just worry. What is going to happen? Many youth worry about, well, now the government has all of this information. Now the government saying that when they made this program, they promised that information was not going to be shared with immigration, but there is a new government now. There is a new administration that's about to start in January. So what's going to happen with that? People are worried about all of my information is now at the hands of the government. Can they come? Can they take me? Can they deport me? Feelings of depression, sadness, and we have already seen that with many people that have the DACA status, and significant worries about suicidal ideation that is likely to occur when people feel hopeless and they feel helpless. A lot of youth fought really hard and organized for years for DACA to happen. It didn't just happen out of Obama's goodness. He did it because there was a lot of pressure, and the youth had been fighting for this for many years. And so now for them, they're here, they have this permit, many of them are able to do things they never dreamed that would be possible, and now this may be taken away. Challenges for families. Well, clearly the biggest fear for families is family separation. And again, to reinforce something that was already said by the presenters, this is not new because with Obama, there were millions of people. He's the president in history that has deported the most people. But given what has been said, we don't know what he's going to do. But he didn't make this promise and still was pretty bad. So for me, I don't know if I would call myself a pessimistic, but I feel like it's important to acknowledge that even when something wasn't promised, it turned out to be pretty bad for a vulnerable segment of the U.S. population. So for this person that from the beginning threatened significant harm to communities of color, I worry that even if it's not as bad as he said it was going to be, that it's going to be pretty bad. And that family separation is going to happen. And again, when we think about families, adults somehow, we have more resources, right? At least psychological resources, ways to cope. But children is who I worry the most about. Because these children have been watching the news, they have been hearing what has been said about their parents, what has been said about them. We have seen since the election an increase in hate crimes, xenophobic crimes, and many of them have happened at the schools, with teachers being some of the perpetrators of this kind of behavior, with peers screaming at their, immigrant-looking peers build a wall. We saw that throughout the election, and we have seen it since then. So these children have been living in fear since the election, and when the election results came out, there was a lot of fear that was increased. So now this is a reality. And how does that impact children? Besides fear, well, many children are experiencing a sense of isolation, and some of them are withdrawing. There is a lot of fear about what if my friends find out? Things that perhaps in the past may not seem as concerning now. Well, if people find out that my family, my parents are undocumented, what will happen? And again, those are real fears. Sadness. What can happen if my parents are taken away? There is a lot of uncertainty, and for little ones, sometimes the parents think, well, they don't understand. They hear the news, but they don't quite understand. And I want to tell you, as a child psychologist, children, if they don't understand, they come up with their own conclusions. And sometimes their conclusions are even scarier than reality. So children listen, they hear, they see, and if the parents think that they're not paying attention, they are paying attention. So a lot of sadness. Some children are experiencing nightmares. Even if it doesn't happen, again, the harm has already been done. Academic difficulties. Many teachers have been talking about their students are not bringing their homework. They're really tired in school. They cannot pay attention. And all of those are, for all of those of you that are mental health professionals, we recognize many of those symptoms as symptoms of trauma. Now, if what was promised actually happens, the consequences will even be worse than what we have already seen, because we know what happens when there is separation of families. There is not a lot of research on that area, but there is some research, and the research says that when families are separated, there is significant amount of trauma that children face. And again, we don't know how if there is deportations, massive deportations, how are they going to be carried out? Based on experiences that we already have of clients that some of you have worked with, that I have worked with, I know that sometimes children are witnesses to the deportations. That if ICE is to come to the house and arrest their parent right in front of them, what would that be like for the child, right? So sense of hopelessness and helplessness. When there is family fragmentation or separation, clearly there will be difficulties with attachment. A parent is there, the children is here. We don't even know what the families are going to do. And that's where we as mental health professionals need to be aware of what's going on so we know how to prepare the families. There is also financial hardship. And we know that already based on the families that have been separated through deportation. Many times a person that is deported is the breadwinner for the family. And the person that stays needs to figure out, how do I now support my family under these circumstances? For the community, there is also challenges. There is uncertainty in the community, there is fear, there is distrust, and these feelings impact many things. They also impact the economy of the country. Since the election, Latinos and Latino immigrants are being very mindful of how they spend their money, because a lot of families are preparing for the worst. A lot of families don't know what's gonna happen. So the numbers haven't come out yet for Black Friday, but a lot of people are saying it looks like in certain communities there was not as much money spent. And I'm willing to say that for a lot of immigrant families, there is concerns. A lot of families are saving, a lot of families are thinking, I don't know what's gonna happen, so I need to be prepared. Financially prepare as much as I can, economically prepare. There is fear, and that fear translates to us. Because many of us in mental health profession, we are perceived as members of the system. So how's that gonna impact us? Well, when our clients come to see us, they may have a whole array of symptoms, but they may not tell us what exactly is happening, because they may be afraid to tell us they're undocumented. They may be afraid to tell us that they're afraid their families may be separated, or that they have DACA and they don't know what's gonna happen. So that fear translates into every segment of society that individual participates in. So what can we do very briefly in the next 4 years? And I will say ongoing, and many of these things have already been done by community organizations. In the community, organize, that's how communities of color, oppressed communities have survived. We have to organize. We have to look into organizations that are already established, that are doing really good work, like faith organizations, organizations that promote human rights, that promote immigrant rights. If you're in the mental health profession, many times we think, well, I'm in mental health, like that's a separate area. But I will say that the conditions that cause the symptoms that bring our clients into therapy are conditions that we have a responsibility to end as well. So finding those organizations, how can we provide support? And you can do it in the way that I'm doing. You have a lot of knowledge if you're a mental health professional about psychological consequences of trauma, of pain, of sadness. So how can you use your skills already in the community? Advocate within mental health. There is tons of professional organizations in psychology. We have the APA, the American Psychological Association. There is American Counseling Association. There is individual organizations that have power and that they can advocate for these communities. We have Latinos, National Latino Psychological Association. And when things like this happen is when we have to go to those organizations and say, you need to show support. Write a letter, send it to the new administration to speak on behalf of communities that at this point have no voice. Or that they have a voice, but their voice is not being heard because they don't have the power. Right? So we can advocate, we can resist. There have been a lot of marches, and the marches are not new, and they're probably not gonna stop, and I hope they don't stop, because it has been through speaking up and through making noise, sometimes disrupting, that things have changed for the better. In mental health, we can educate ourselves. You're sitting here and thinking, well, I don't know a lot about this topic. It's time to learn, because what you don't know can prevent you from being the best counselor or therapist that you can. So educate yourself, educate others, educate your own clients. A lot of organizations are now distributing a lot of information about how do people protect their own rights. What to do if immigration officials come to their door, right? So your clients can be prepared. How do you develop a plan? And I have some handouts here that I can pass out at the end. If you are a parent that is undocumented, they have children here in this country, there are organizations that have created a plan to prepare for that. And you in therapy can do that with your parents. You can create a plan for safety in case parents are arrested or deported, so that their children are already taken care of. Because what has happened is that when parents have no plan, many times the children end up in the protection of DCFS. And sometimes the children are placed in foster care, and many times they're placed in adoption, even when they have parents that love them and want them. So as a mental health professional, you can help them create a plan. If they have already been arrested, there is other handouts that have been developed that I can also distribute at the end. Once a parent is arrested, how can their parental rights be protected? Parents need to know that, and that's something that we can do as mental health professionals. Again, we can advocate, because at this point, if we don't say anything, we're allowing things to continue. So the famous statement, silence is consent. So sitting in our places of comfort and not speaking up when we see something unjust happening means that we have allowed it to happen. And then research. For those of you that are into research, there is tons of research to be done. What are the consequences of this past year? Mental health consequences. For children, for adolescents, for adults, how have they impacted work productivity? How have they impacted academic productivity, relationships, families? There has been all sorts of things that have happened. How can we create culturally congruent, racially congruent treatments to deal with the aftermath of what has happened and what may happen? And there is a lot of research that hasn't been done that still needs to be done. So I think we can do this. I'll do this at the end if we have time. But basically, if you haven't watched, this was a video by Juno Diaz where he talked about the skills, the survival skills of Latinos. He gave it when he received the award from the Hispanic Heritage Foundation. And that is a word of hope, basically, that says we have survived a lot. So while there is a lot of uncertainty happening right now, I think this will not kill us all, right? That some of us will survive, many of us will fight, and that we will continue fighting for our community. And the biggest hope, I think, is in the children that are witnessing what's happening and that are gonna grow up with an even stronger identity and a stronger sense of purpose to make this country a lot better than it has been in the last year.
Well, thank you very much to the three, presenters, panelists right now. I think all of them, talk from their experience, and they all are basically had a call to action to all of us. So, but I wanted to open up at this moment the opportunity for all of you to have questions or to statements, whatever you want, to any of the presenters. You have until 1:30, so please feel free. And remember to speak up, so those that are online are also able to, learn from your questions or for your comments. So we have a microphone that will pass by, and so do we have any questions?
Is it on?
Is it on? No. No? No, no. Hello? Yeah? Okay. First of all, thank you for all that. My question is, I've experienced the traumas of immigration detention centers and firsthand, and it's still, it happened 2 years ago, but it's still very difficult to even talk about. And I've spoken to a lot of other people that have gone through it as well, inmates who have come out of the immigration detention centers. And you're right, the difficulty in that is that a lot of them, they don't want to talk to people. They don't want to tell them about their immigration statuses, and they don't want to tell them about their experiences as well, because it is traumatizing and them being in there. So how can we start a conversation with them about that? Or like, what can they do if they won't go to someone and talk to them and get, and go to a psychologist or someone else who can help them about these things? What can they do? Especially for people who, let's say, it's not even about just the immigration status, it's more about if they have the insurance to cover that, to go talk to someone, or different things in their communities and things like that. So what can we do to help them?
I think one of the biggest challenges and reasons why people may be hesitant to share is because there is no trust, right? And not having trust under those circumstances is actually a protective factor, is healthy. And so I think the thing that we can do is gain their trust. And that is true of anybody that has experienced any sort of trauma. Rather than pushing or wanting the person to share when they're not ready, build the trust so that when they are ready, they can begin to share in their own terms in a way that feels safe. I also think that another barrier for the reason why people don't want to talk is because sometimes not only do they have to share their experience, but they have to explain things to the therapist that the therapist should already know. And that's where education takes place and is necessary. Because if I'm sharing my experience of trauma in a detention center and the journey to the US, and then at every sentence, when I'm trying to tell you that, you interrupt me to ask me about, oh, but why did you come here? And why, and all of those things that the therapist should already know also create a situation where people don't want to talk. Because instead of being affirmed, they're questioned. Instead of being validated, they're blamed. And so I think building trust, waiting for the client to be ready, and also understanding why is it that they may not be ready to talk, I think so we can do.
Any other panelists?
Yeah.
And then, yeah.
I really believe that we need to come to grips, with the fact that the society we live in today is not a society that really shows that it cares, about the well-being of people in general. And you can measure that by how much more difficult it has become, for people to access adequate medical care, including mental health care. But the reality is we do not live in a society that truly values, the well-being of human beings. And on top of that, we also need to recognize that